Victory for religious freedom. Justices on the Supreme Court side with a Colorado-based Christian baker who declined to make a cake for a same-sex wedding ceremony. We have reaction. Pro-life push. The public has a chance to weigh in on whether voters want taxpayer dollars to fund abortion. Hope for healing. Victims of clergy sex abuse are optimistic after a meeting with Pope Francis this weekend. And the gift of vocations. The Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend, Indiana ordains 5 new priests. We introduce you to one. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, June 4th, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Lauren Ashburn is on assignment. The Supreme Court rules in favor of a Colorado baker who wouldn't create a cake for a gay wedding reception. But the 7-2 ruling doesn't answer the question of whether a business can invoke religious objections to refuse service to gays and lesbians. Correspondent Jason Calvi spoke to both sides and joins us from the Supreme Court. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Wyatt. The decision is limited to the case of Jack Phillips, who is a Christian. Now, the High Court says he suffered anti-religious bias at the hands of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. That panel said Phillips discriminated against a gay couple, but in the Supreme Court's view, Colorado violated his First Amendment rights. Jack Phillips owns Masterpiece Cake Shop in the suburbs of Denver. In 2012, he told Charlie Craig and Dave Mullins he couldn't create a cake for their wedding reception. I spoke to Phillips in December, the day the High Court heard oral arguments.
And I just hope now that the justices will look at this case and allow creative professionals like myself to create freely according to their conscience. And that nobody else has to go through what my family and I have gone through for the last 5 years.
Phillips' lawyer is calling the ruling a complete victory.
Jack's very grateful that the Supreme Court has protected his religious freedom. He was willing to serve all people, just not all messages was he willing to create. So the fact that the court said religious freedom is important and needs to be in the balance, that's a really important principle.
In his majority opinion, Justice Anthony Kennedy writes that the treatment by Colorado's Civil Rights Commission has some elements of a clear and impermissible hostility towards sincere religious beliefs. But he also says the issue must await further elaboration. Gay rights groups are emphasizing that.
This decision only applies to this particular baker. In no way did the Supreme Court challenge the application of non-discrimination laws, including non-discrimination laws that cover LGBTQ people.
Appeals in similar cases are pending, including one at the Supreme Court from a florist who didn't want to provide flowers for a same-sex wedding. The Supreme Court could decide this month whether to pick up that case. The question tonight is still unanswered. Does the First Amendment allow business owners to say no to working same-sex weddings? Wyatt?
Okay, Jason, so Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sonia Sotomayor were the two that did not agree with the majority opinion. So did the court give any indication about future cases?
Justice Kennedy says the courts cannot disrespect sincere religious beliefs, but he says gay people should not suffer indignities when seeking services in an open market. Now, Jack Phillips' lawyers tell me today's ruling does move the needle because the court says religious values need to be taken seriously.
Jason Calvi reporting from the Supreme Court. Thanks, Jason. And coming up later in the show, we'll have reaction to the Supreme Court decision with Ryan Anderson, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. The Supreme Court also sides with the Trump administration in an abortion case. It wipes away a lower court judge's ruling in favor of the pregnant immigrant teen who received an abortion. Government lawyers complained after the ACLU failed to alert them the abortion would be earlier than expected. For the first time, the public can weigh in on a Trump administration proposal that would stop family planning money from going to abortion providers. The Protect Life rule cannot go into effect until it passes a 60-day review that allows Americans to take part in the political process. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. The proposal backed by President Trump would eliminate money in the Title X family planning program from going to abortionists like Planned Parenthood. The government has opened this topic up for public debate, and pro-life organizations say it's time to speak up.
It's an opportunity missed if we don't stand up for life.
Marilyn Musgrave of the Susan B. Anthony list helps elect pro-life lawmakers. She says Planned Parenthood receives $50 to $60 million annually in Title X funds. But now the Trump administration has proposed that should stop, and the public can too.
Saying that we agree with the president with the Protect Life rule that will separate the taxpayer from abortion funding.
Last week, the Department of Health and Human Services opened up the proposed rule to 60 days of public feedback. It cannot go into effect until after that period. The new rule would not cut the amount of taxpayer money that goes to family planning, but it would keep it from abortion providers. The president announced the change last month.
My administration has proposed a new rule to prohibit Title X funding from going to any clinic that performs abortions.
Musgrave says abortion supporters will make their voices heard during the public comment period. Now she's calling on pro-life Americans to speak up.
If you were Planned Parenthood and you had $50 to $60 million a year to lose, you can bet that the Planned Parenthood supporters are going to weigh in on this. So it's very important for pro-life people around this country to also weigh in, and I do believe that comments make a difference.
If you want to leave a comment for the Department of Health and Human Services, we posted a link on our EWTN News Nightly Facebook page. You have until July 31st to let the administration know how you feel about these proposed changes to family planning funding. Wyatt?
Mark, when do pro-lifers hope this Protect Life rule will actually go into effect?
Susan B. Anthony list is hopeful that it will happen soon after that public comment period closes, but for now, there is no set time. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. President Trump says he has the absolute right to pardon himself. The president calls the special counsel's probe into possible collusion by Russia in the 2016 election, quote, totally unconstitutional. He also says it's a, quote, never-ending witch hunt. Melania Trump is expected to make her first public appearance tonight after about 3 weeks. The First Lady will attend a White House event for families of veterans killed in the Iraq War, but she is not expected to travel to the G7 summit later this week in Quebec. She is recovering from a medical procedure last month to treat a kidney issue. As Congress gavels in this week, some voters are asking GOP lawmakers to push their party to protect young dreamer immigrants from deportation. Join us tomorrow for a special edition of EWTN News Nightly. Lauren Ashburn will report from the U.S.-Mexico border. She will show us what the Catholic Church is doing to help immigrants, as well as how U.S. Customs and Border agents are beefing up security. That's tomorrow at 6 and 9 p.m. Eastern, right here on EWTN News Nightly. Police shoot a man who allegedly waved a knife inside a Protestant cathedral yesterday in Berlin. Around 100 people were evacuated safely. A policeman was shot inadvertently by his colleague. He suffered minor injuries and was released from the hospital. Police say there is no immediate indication the 53-year-old suspect has any links to terrorism. A suicide bomber targets a gathering of Afghanistan's top clerics, killing at least 7 people and wounding 20. Shortly before, the religious leaders had issued a decree against such attacks and called for peace talks. No group immediately claimed responsibility for the strike. Officials say at least 62 people are dead after a volcano erupted over the weekend in Guatemala. It sent clouds of ash 6 miles into the air west of Guatemala City Sunday. The charred landscape was so hot it melted the shoes of rescuers. More than 3,000 people have been evacuated. The death toll is expected to rise. Pope Francis digs deeper into the roots of Chile's sex abuse scandal by meeting Saturday with a group of priests who were victims of abuse. One expressed confidence in the Holy Father. Father Eugenio de la Fuente and another priest providing support to the group spoke to journalists on Saturday night. De la Fuente was abused by Father Fernando Caradima, a powerful preacher in Chile who abused young parishioners. For more on this, we're joined by Vatican correspondent Juliet Lindley, who joins us from Rome. Juliet, what can you tell us about the meeting between the Holy Father and those victims?
Wyatt, the Pope told the victims to focus on the future rather than on the past and to help preserve unity in the Church. The victims say the Pope listened and consoled them at length and that their 4-hour meeting with the Pontiff was longer than expected. One priest says the Holy Father was empathetic and that he was very much impacted by his pain, and that Francis has a deep understanding of the problem and clear ideas of how to move forward. Now, Francis invited the group to stay at his residence in the Vatican at Santa Marta, and he said Mass with them in the morning before holding the meetings.
Wow, I'm still thinking about the fact that the meeting was 4 hours long. Tell us more about Fernando Caradima, who's at the center of the scandal.
Indeed. So Father Fernando Caradima ran a parish that served the upper classes in Santiago, in Chile, in the 70s and 80s. Now, the parish generated 30 priests and 4 bishops before Caradima was removed from ministry. Caradima was found guilty of sexually and psychologically abusing young parishioners by the Vatican in 2011 and was sentenced to a lifetime of penance and prayer. But Caradima was never tried, nor was he convicted in a civil court of law, Wyatt. And the bishop, Juan Barros, was one of them, at the center of the media firestorm in January after Francis forcefully defended him against allegations that he knew of the abuse that was being perpetrated by Caradima. Now, the Pope then admitted that he had been mistaken.
Okay, so now looking ahead, what do you think is next for the Chilean church? I mean, has the Vatican promised action?
Well, the Vatican says that it hopes to help heal the divisions that the scandal has created in Chile's church. And church leaders say they want to help rebuild healthy relationships between priests and their flock. Quote, once they become conscious of their own wounds. Now, Wyatt, it's important to point out that last week Pope Francis became the first pontiff to publicly denounce a culture of abuse and cover-up in the Catholic Church, saying, never again, in inverted commas, in quotes. Now, all eyes are on the Holy Father to see what he will do about the Chilean bishops who have offered their resignations en masse. Pope Francis has not clearly made his decision public as yet.
And whatever decision he decides to make, it will take time, I'm sure, to heal those relationships between the Chilean clergy and the people there. Juliet Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Pope Francis meets with leaders from Germany's Lutheran Church. He says the groups have, quote, overcome old prejudices on both sides. The Holy Father says Christian unity will be fostered by the Holy Spirit. Pope Francis appoints a bishop to manage the Archdiocese of Adelaide, Australia, after its archbishop is convicted of covering up for a pedophile priest. Bishop Gregory O'Kelly will take over for Archbishop Philip Wilson. Wilson faces a possible 2-year prison term. And the Pope names his personal theologian and ghostwriter to the head of the Archdiocese of La Plata in his native Argentina. Archbishop Victor Manuel Fernandez helped the Holy Father write his first major document, The Joy of the Gospel, and was involved in drafting of The Joy of Love. Coming up, the Supreme Court sides with a Colorado baker who wouldn't make a wedding cake for a same-sex ceremony, what it means for religious freedom in America. And the church in Nicaragua mourns the loss of the former Archbishop of Managua. A spokesperson for former President George H.W. Bush confirms the president's release from a Maine hospital today. He says Bush is appreciative of all the care and all the good wishes he has received. The former president was treated for low blood pressure and fatigue. He is currently 93 years old and recently lost his wife Barbara Bush in April. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. We told you earlier about the Supreme Court ruling in favor of a Christian baker who declined to make a wedding cake for a same-sex ceremony. Some members of the gay community say they are disappointed.
We are saddened, but we're not shocked. And the fact that the opinion was written by Justice Kennedy is makes it a little bit more saddened, because we know that he's stood up for LGBT equality in the past.
Several other disputes similar to the Masterpiece Cake Shop case are pending. One involves a Christian florist in Washington state. She's appealing a ruling saying she violated the law when she refused to provide flowers for a same-sex marriage ceremony. The justices may decide that case by the end of June. Joining me now to take a closer look at today's Supreme Court decision is Ryan Anderson, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Ryan, welcome back to the program. Today's ruling appears to be a victory for religious liberty, but it's also what's called a limited ruling. What does that mean, and how does that impact the larger fight for religious freedom in our country?
Sure. Well, I mean, today's victory is a big win for all Americans, including all Americans who believe that marriage is the union of a husband and wife. The Supreme Court said in a 7-2 ruling that the state of Colorado had shown undue hostility towards Jack Phillips and his religious beliefs by not even considering that they would deserve First Amendment protection. And so the court ruled 7-2, protecting Jack Phillips and his right to be able to run his business in accordance with his belief that marriage unite husband and wife. Now, of course, we'll have to see how this applies to other cases. As you mentioned, the critics are saying that it's a limited ruling, but for today, it's a big win, and it's a 7-2 win.
I want to have you respond to the critics, because a lot of them say that bakers like Jack Phillips are discriminating against same-sex couples. What's your response to that?
He's not discriminating at all. And this is something that Justice Gorsuch really pulls out very nicely in his concurring opinion. He says the baker, Jack Phillips, doesn't even take into consideration the identity of his customers. He won't bake a cake celebrating a same-sex wedding, regardless of who asks him to bake that cake. It doesn't matter the identity of the people. It matters his identity and what sort of speech he can speak, what sort of celebrations he can celebrate. It's about him. It's not about the customer. And Gorsuch pulls this out by showing that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission agreed with that line of thinking in 3 other cases. There were 3 bakers who refused to do anti-gay cakes, and the commission said that's not discrimination. But when Jack Phillips says he can't do a pro-gay marriage cake, that all of a sudden is discrimination. And so the Supreme Court today, 7-2, said that's a double standard, and that the state of Colorado can't apply a double standard simply to denigrate and demean and stigmatize Jack Phillips.
It's interesting, Ryan, hearing you talk about this case in particular, because it reminds us of another case that we're closely watching, a florist out of Washington State, Baronelle Stutzman, who's appealing a state Supreme Court ruling in her state that she violated state law for refusing to provide wedding flowers for 2 men. So how do you think today's decision will affect her case and others across the country?
So if you just look at today's holding, part of it we'll see, was there explicit animus towards Baronelle and her religious beliefs? You could see how SOGI laws are being used, SOGI laws being sexual orientation and gender identity anti-discrimination statutes. They're being used as swords to persecute people rather than as shields to protect people. And as Justice Gorsuch pointed out, you can't say that you're discriminating based on someone else's identity when what you're really doing is trying to prevent yourself from being complicit in an event or in speech that you can't celebrate or that you can't speak.
Such an interesting case, and one that we'll, like I said, we'll continue to follow to figure out how this applies to other cases and what the implications are. Ryan Anderson, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, thanks so much for your analysis.
Thank you.
Pope Francis calls for an end to what he calls brutalities in Nicaragua, adding he feels pain over the government's violent response to protesters.
Degli vescovi del Nicaragua nell'esprimere dolore per le gravi violenze.
At his weekly Angelus address, the Holy Father asked for dialogue to resume between anti-government protesters and President Daniel Ortega. Catholic leaders are helping mediate those talks, but they broke down last week. The former head of the Archdiocese of Managua, Nicaragua, has died. Cardinal Emeritus Miguel Obando y Bravo passed away yesterday. The Salesian served as Archbishop for 37 years before retiring in 2005. He played an important mediator role throughout Nicaragua's recent violent political history. The Cardinal was 92 years old. Up next, Pope Francis celebrates the feast of Corpus Christi. And most likely to succeed, 4 high school classmates in Indiana are ordained priests. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. Bishop George Murray is released from the Cleveland Clinic following 1 month of intense treatment for leukemia. Doctors say they are pleased with his progress, but he will return once a week for checkups. Bishop Murray has led the Diocese of Youngstown, Ohio since 2007. He says he's grateful for everyone's prayers. The Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend in Indiana just celebrated its largest priestly ordination in 43 years. 5 men from Mount St. Mary Seminary were ordained Saturday in the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception in Fort Wayne. 4 of the new priests also graduated in the same class from Bishop Dwenger High School in 2009. One of them talks to me next. Joining us from Fort Wayne, Indiana is Father Patrick Hake. Father Patrick, welcome to the program and congratulations. When did you know you wanted to become a priest and what influenced you?
Thank you. The moment that first entered my mind was during a retreat in high school when I was a sophomore. Back then, though, I wanted to fit in, so I didn't tell people about it. I hid it. it wasn't until I was in college that I decided to try seminary out because I was truly happy back then. I thought back then I was happy. I wanted to be a priest. Let's try it out. Worked out pretty well. The major influences were probably all the young, happy priests that I saw at my parish. We had a lot of associates back then that were young and happy, so it was an influence on me. There was an old, happy priest. We saw priests that were happy at the beginning, priests that were happy at the end, and it was good. Yes.
So you're one of 4 priests actually from the same high school class. What a blessing
Yes.
is that now to share within this priestly brotherhood. Tell us about that experience.
It's awesome just because there's so much history between all the guys. We were all friends in high school. We were all friends in seminary, and we were all friends as priests. It's a great blessing for me.
Yeah,
for all of us.
and you never hear about that. I mean, that is such a rare thing. And you celebrated your first Mass of Thanksgiving yesterday. Tell us about what that was like.
It's pretty incredible. You know, it's something I've been going to Mass like every day for the past 6 years, even longer than that, and just being able to say those words, it was truly awesome in true sense of the word.
How has
Yes.
this whole experience, I mean, being in the seminary, having friends like that you shared a high school experience with, how has all of this been in terms of your faith journey to become closer to Christ?
I would say it'd been a great aid. Being around guys that are all striving for the same thing. You know, the people there weren't trying out for money, weren't trying out for power. They were going there for the love of God. We were able to support each other through all the trials and all the joys. So it's been a great blessing.
So you're only 27 years old, Father. As you begin your ministry as a priest, what's your advice to young men who may be considering a vocation?
I would say that God wants you to be happy, and that God has a purpose for you. If you follow God's purpose for you, you'll be happy. So if God's calling you to be a priest, you should answer that call because God wants you to be happy. And by saying yes to Him, you'll be most happy.
Such important advice, and it's so incredible to hear your story about how you drew so close to Christ in the Eucharist as well, and your whole experience with your high school classmates too. Father Patrick Hake, Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you very much.
And that wraps up our newscast for tonight. We thank you for watching. Be sure to join us tomorrow as our Lauren Ashburn reports from along the U.S.-Mexico border, highlighting key issues like immigration. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We leave you tonight with the Pope's Corpus Christi procession, which took place yesterday outside of Rome. Good night, and God bless.